Hi everyone, welcome to this session. Today we're going to be looking a little bit deeper at blended learning. So the session we did during induction week looked at possible approaches to blended learning. Today we're going to kind of have a look at maybe some of the background behind the approaches you can take in models of blended learning, as well as really looking at maybe some of the applications that you may want to utilize when you're actually delivering your placements. So the outcomes of today, we'll have a brief discussion recap overview of what blended learning is and what it isn't. We will take a look at some of the better known models of blended learning. We'll talk a little bit about the impact on learning, but also the impact on learners as well. What is needed going forward from both a school point of view and also from teachers and the kind of experience and opportunities, I suppose, that we need to give to teachers. How to do it right, based on some research, some reading, what has worked, and then really a review and reflect section. One for us to review and reflect on what our approaches might be, but also thinking about what schools possibly need to do going forward, which is potentially where your action research is going to come in. Now, I've had a couple of questions about this recently, so I may as well address this to everyone in one fell swoop as part of this video. The ideal situation, obviously, for any project where you're going into schools is that you can be in schools for 4 weeks and 5 days of each of that week. The situation we're in is that's not possible. So what we wanted to do was let's actually utilize this from a research point of view and see, what does work and what doesn't work, and where, yes, some schools do not have very good access to technology. Well, do you know what? When they were forced into a lockdown, they had to come up with a solution. And if they didn't come up with a very good solution, then that's part of your research. And that's actually going to be really beneficial to the school for you to say, look, this is what would work, but you're not in a position to be able to do it. So the things you're doing are not having any impact. So you might want to change the things you're doing. I'm not asking you to go into a school and actually perform miracles and in 4 weeks change the lives of all of the children that you're working with, and the outcomes are going to show that their reading age has improved or their ability to do maths is massively jumped. That's not what we're doing. You're really taking the opportunity to specialize on something you are passionate about, be it drama, music, art, literacy, numeracy, whatever it might be. And then the research project, really, how could you do that through a blended learning approach where you're supporting the school in having an understanding of what is possible and what isn't possible? Yes, the teachers may or may not carry out some of your learning within the classroom time, but that's neither here nor there. You're trying to promote an opportunity for those students to learn outside of the classroom. That's what blended learning offers an opportunity for. You will have a day a week to support them face to face with whatever you might want to offer them, but there will be opportunities for them to learn beyond that. Now, if they don't have access to technology at home, that's what your review is part of. Because if we went back into a lockdown model, the same as we did before, what would students do then? If they don't have access to technology at home, how were the teachers supporting them? So yes, you might have to provide paper handouts for them to have because they don't have technology at home, but you know what? There's part of your review. That's the impact piece. And as you look at how it could have been done, you'll be able to compare it to how you did it, and that's your outcome. Your outcome is not whether or not children have actually benefited from learning and that they've improved their levels. This is not teaching practice. This is not you going out and being judged on how good you can teach and whether or not you've met any standards. This is not that. This is a completely different approach. It's still part of teaching. It's what teachers do all the time. But up to now, you've had the opportunity to focus hugely on what you do as a practitioner in terms of classroom practice. This is your opportunity to explore what teachers do beyond that, to actually think about what makes a difference in the classroom, step back for a little bit, see what you can do that's different. And believe me, in the majority of cases, you will be contributing to that school, because should they have to go into another lockdown situation, and it might not be now, it might be in years to come, when something like this potentially happens again, they will have an understanding of what they need to do differently. And beyond that, this is not just about COVID. This is about blended learning as an opportunity to see how people learn in different ways, and not necessarily through the traditional medium of you go to school from 9 till 3, Monday to Friday, for 6 half terms a year, and we all come out at the other end brilliant, because that isn't the case. facts will show you that about 60 to 70% of children will succeed in that model, and we pretty much fail 30% of those students every single year. And there's an opportunity now for us to have a look at how that 30% may be supported better if we think about what education actually looks like beyond its traditional. So there we go, rant over about why we're doing this. But please do keep in your mind, we are not judging you on you teaching in the classroom. We are not coming to watch you teach. The mentors in school are not observing you teach. They will probably watch you, but there's no written observations on what you do. This is purely about what approach to blended learning works best in the school you're in. There we go. Right, so moving on to what is blended learning then. So let's just recap this whole idea of what we mean by blended learning. Now, we've been doing this for years. Okay, this has been around. We do this as such on your course. The blend is that you spend part of your time in university face-to-face and part of your time in school doing practice, where you actually get to experiment those things. That's a type of blended learning because you have those what we'll come to talk about as lab sessions, where you actually get to try out some of the learning that you actually do. Blended learning is not just about technology. Obviously, technology has a role to play in blended learning, can provide opportunity for distance learning, those sorts of things. But blended learning is multiple approaches, not just the traditional idea all of the time. There's a huge link to future jobs here. If we get this right, if we really do support students in this understanding, then blended learning also lends itself to blended working. So how can we, yes, sometimes work in an office, but also work from home? And you'll see in the news, lots of people have had to make that transition to how do I work from home? How do I work in the office? Some people struggled, some people didn't, some people have benefited, some people haven't. But half that is down to we've always done it one way and no one really has the ability to look outside of those things. So you have to start to think differently. You have to start to think about the future is not about building huge office blocks in cities and everyone travels into them. And, you know, when there's an accident on the tube or something like that you can't get to work on time, that you're paying for heating bills in a building. And actually that means your price of the thing you sell has to go up because you're having to pay for the office space to cover it. Whereas actually people have worked perfectly well at home, having meetings online and using office time when they really need to use office time, not just for the sake of everyone sitting around in an office, because there's a notion that if you're sat in your workspace, you're working. Because believe me, people can waste time in an office space as much as they could potentially waste time at home. And there are lots of studies starting to appear where companies are starting to look at 4-day weeks, where they know that if I give you an extra day off but ask you to do the same amount of work, well, you'll probably be more productive in those 4 days because you get 3 days off as a long weekend. So, you know, this alternative approach to working is going to be something that we can start to develop the adaptability skills in our students. It's also an opportunity to redefine the role of the teacher. No longer is it about standing at the front and telling everybody everything, because you know very well you can find out lots of the answers on the internet to some of those things. So the role of the teacher is really to support those individuals, to support the engagement. Are they interested? Do they have specific issues about things they want to develop? How do we encourage them? How do we support them, develop them? You know, all of those other things that teachers do that robots will not be able to do and Google does not have the answer to, they are really important. So your role as a teacher is not, I stand at the front and I'm going to teach you how to do maths. It's not that. It's, I stand at the front and I'm going to support you in understanding how we can learn maths. And yes, with some people, I'm going to have to teach it to you very direct. With other people, do you know what? You might find a different way to do this on the internet. And I've seen this for myself. My own son has benefited from having education away from school because it's afforded him more time, and his teacher took a very, very different role in this situation, where his teacher really supported him, gave him feedback, pushed him in the right direction, but he took ownership of his maths. So whereas before, when he hated it, he now actually feels that he can learn it because there's more than one way to learn these things. We've talked about flipped learning before. You have all experienced flipped learning. I know Kelly does flipped learning quite a lot as part of her design technology sessions in year 2. And we've talked about this idea of thinking about the structure of the school day. And in most cases, predominantly in secondary education, teachers will talk about the fact that the content is so rich, they don't have time to do it in a fun way in the classroom. So therefore it becomes very much, you know, I'm going to stand at the front, I'm going to tell you stuff, you're going to write it in a book, so there'll be an exam at the end of the year and we'll all hopefully pass the exam. Well, flipped learning is the opportunity to say, okay, well, the piece that the teacher is good at is supporting the students in developing and understanding. The piece that the teacher could easily be replaced in is content delivery. So I'm going to tell you everything about the water cycle, and then for your homework, I'm going to ask you to make sense of what I've told you. Flipped learning is putting that on its head. You could create a video the students could watch in their own time, much as you're doing now with this. And actually, if we had some face-to-face time, we'd have that opportunity to break down these ideas, to discuss them in more detail, but we don't necessarily need to spend all the time learning about flipped learning, which is why I'm not going to teach you about flipped learning now. I'm going to say, if you find some links on flipped learning, watch some videos, you can find out everything you need to. The discussion part that comes on the back of that, where we can have a discussion about flipped learning, is the role of the teacher, and that's an important thing. So on that note, I'm going to ask you at this point to just pause the video, and I'm going to ask you to just jump into our Padlet wall and have a discussion about flipped learning. What do you see as the benefit of flipped learning in a primary classroom? Okay, next thing then, breaking the one-size-fits-all model. This has been, unfortunately, something which is still happening in education now, that this is how we do it, and then we slightly make it harder for our more able, and we make it slightly easier for our less able. But do you know what? We're pretty much going to plan for this middle group of students and hope that they mostly fit into that. Well, the thing is, what COVID exposed in education is that there is more than one way to learn. And we've known it for some time. The problem is the cat's out of the bag on this, and students have now seen it for themselves. And I'm talking about primary age students that have seen there is an opportunity for them to learn in a very different way, in a time that works for them, in a way that works for them. And that personalization of learning is going to be very difficult for you to go back to. There are students that, yes, have struggled by not being spoon-fed information, because that was the norm for them. The teacher would tell them the stuff that they had to learn. They go away and learn it. They pass an exam. They do well at the end of it. But the world doesn't need people that are just spoon-fed. And again, COVID has uncovered that, because you can look at businesses that have struggled because the way we always did it has changed, and we don't know what to do because we don't know anything different, and we haven't got any adaptability skills. And then there are businesses that have absolutely thrived because they've been able to adapt to a different way of thinking, and their model has changed because they haven't stuck to this one size fits all. I'm the shop and you come to me. They've thought about, okay, well, how can we adapt what we do to make it safer for people, to still have our business, to still have customer service, so we can still sell the things that we sell, but we do it in a way that it's going to work within the restrictions that we're in at the moment. There's an opportunity with blended learning to be more engaging and creative. I mentioned this before about the additional time with something like flipped learning. It means that in the classroom, you actually then do have time to develop this engagement and creativity. And this links hugely to the 4 purposes of the curriculum, and getting students to be creative and entrepreneurial and think differently about their things. We want that in our students. The technology allows us to do that with our students. And I'm talking here more than make a presentation, make a document, or make a spreadsheet. I'm talking about making movies and using augmented reality and doing those things that are actually going to engage a learner. And the evidence shows that multimedia learning is absolutely a way of learning. And when you were in your early years placements, you would have known that multimedia learning is absolutely the thing that you would have done most of the time, where students would have engaged in video, they would have engaged in song, they would have engaged in doing things, you know, just not reading something out of a book or being told something in one dimension, which is literacy. And that is, I either say the words or you read the words and you write them down in your book. So hopefully we can start to see that opportunity to be a lot more creative. Flexible delivery, mentioned this kind of before about the being able to learn anytime and anywhere. Teachers obviously can create those resources. I've created this video for you now. You might be watching this during the timetabled session of 10 till 12 on the Monday. You very well might be watching this earlier than that, because I will have put it up earlier than the Monday. You might be watching this after the Monday. because you all have busy lives, you all have other interests. You don't work only for doing this course. You have, some of you might have families, you'll have partners, you may have other jobs that you need to attend to. So blended learning allows you to still have that learning opportunity, but flexible. It doesn't have to all happen at the same time for everybody, but it doesn't mean that anyone is also at a loss, because you can access it whenever you need to. And then obviously there's the huge role of technology in this. We said before that it doesn't always have to be about technology, but technology hugely helps. I think during COVID, schools and educators have started to see that where once this was a nicety, it's now a necessity. You have to think about the role of technology. Lots of studies have shown that children can benefit. There are different ways that people can benefit, and there's been a fight between, oh, we don't see as it's needed in schools and all of this. And I've tried to promote it, but I'll be honest, there are times when I think I should push it more. There's always that fear that you're just going to get the pushback from the traditionalists. Well, now the shoe's on the other foot, and I'll be open to tell you, technology will make a difference to children in the classroom. And I'm not just talking ICT, I'm talking about access and the barriers that we put up to most children because they can't write very well or they can't spell very well, when writing and spelling is not the be all and end all in the world. Communication is important. Being able to write, being able to spell are actually important things, but they're not the sole thing to mean that in a science lesson and an RE lesson and a French lesson and a Welsh lesson and all of these other things, you just focus on the ability to write things down. We also can learn through different things, and I would encourage you to look at Multimedia Learning by Richard Meyer, dual coding theory, lots of other things which will talk about the role of technology in supporting students to learn, and again, access to learning. Because one thing I learned over the summer from the amount of webinars that I was able to attend globally and listen to fantastic speakers is the term special needs in schools was invented by us as educators, because we teach to the masses, and if you were outside the masses, you had something called special needs. Special needs only exists because of the way we teach to the masses, and we don't teach to those people on the outsides. Now, some of that is because we didn't have access to the technology. We do now, and we should really be utilizing it to support our students in various different ways. I'm not saying use technology all the time, but technology should be used if it's there to support students to access learning. And we've mentioned this already, the anytime, anywhere. You don't have to be in university, you don't have to be in school to learn. Children for months were not in school when they were doing their learning, and they had an opportunity to really think about, do I learn best between 9:30 and 10:30 doing maths, or actually is it better to leave that till the afternoon because I feel a little bit more awake? And the thing is, we're just about starting to even think about when people learn best at different times. And again, the fact that education has said for years now that literacy and numeracy take place in the morning and the other subjects take place in the afternoon, that might be right for some, it might be right for many, but it isn't going to be right for all. And we've gone down a route where we've suddenly think that this is the way to do it because research has said that this is right. Research will tell you what research wants to tell you sometimes. And I think what this has uncovered is that there are alternative ways to do things. And again, blended learning is not just about COVID, it is also how the technology can be used in face-to-face sessions and in distance learning. So there are huge opportunities for students in the classroom to be able to watch a video which explains something the teachers explained once at the start, but the student didn't understand. Being able to access that video as many times as they need to check their own understanding means they'll engage in learning rather than sit waiting with their hand up to ask the teacher to explain it again. And for the teacher, that's wasting their time just explaining things over and over again. So there's an obvious example of where technology can support the teacher in doing that. So using your iPad and a stylus pen to explain things whilst mirroring it to the board, which is what you would do on a whiteboard anyway, but choosing to record the screen whilst you're doing it and then sending that video to the students through a learning platform like Seesaw or Showbie or whatever it might be, means they can have access in the classroom if they have access to technology, which they really should have for this exact reason. but they would also have access to that at home. So if they didn't understand it fully in school and had homework set and mum and dad were at home, the video is there to support the parents, to support the children, and then it becomes a lot more holistic and supportive. So these are some models of blended learning. I'm not going to go into huge detail again, because you don't need me to just tell you things that you can find out in your own time, but we alluded to these in the induction session about different models of blended learning. So let's just briefly look over some of them. So the face-to-face model really is one of probably the most typical examples, but also the one that's probably most close to what you do at the moment. So the idea here is that some students in the classroom would still need to have that face-to-face support in a very traditional way, but there may be some students in the classroom that don't need to sit and listen to the teacher go through the whole explanation. An example of this might be a student who's absolutely passionate about World War II, and the teacher is talking to the students about World War II, but this student loves it and has been reading about it and is passionate about it and watches films about it and all sorts of things. Do they need to sit and listen to the teacher, or could they actually go off and start on an activity where technology scaffolds it for them? So the teacher could have pre-made some resources that engage the student, challenge the student, some problem-solving type activities. So we're still all in the same class together, but some students have that opportunity to say, do you know what, I'm going to go and work in my own pace without having to be led by the teacher. It could also be the opposite of that, where the students can work with the teacher developing a project, but some of the students need maybe the technology to support them with something to give them more input, to give them some overview. We do this with TAs. We're not all blessed to have as many TAs as we would probably love to have in a classroom, but the technology can act as a TA for you at some times, just to give that support for the student to work at their own pace. Then we have the self-blend model. So the self-blend model kind of probably more for older children. You might see this in upper key stage 2, I suppose, but very much for older students. And that is where those students can potentially opt to supplement their learning with something else. So yes, you can have that face-to-face option, but you could also create courses where students can go off and learn for themselves. So this is, part one is the stuff that we have to do in school. But if you love this, if this is something you're passionate about, here's a course where you could go and find out something else. Now, it could be created by the school, but it could be also something which takes that student further. An example here might be if you were teaching children art, but you didn't have necessarily the skills yourselves to teach them a certain type of art, but you found some videos on YouTube that could support them with that the student could go home and in their own time, because they're passionate about it, really push themselves to develop a deeper understanding of those things. So again, it's that self-choice, they get to choose those things. The rotation model, so this is where you would rotate on like a fixed schedule. Again, similar to what we do. Early years is fantastic at this with the way that we will rotate, classes. Sometimes you're face to face with the students. Sometimes they're off playing in the sandpits and doing some continuous and extended provision activities there. Sometimes they might be using technology to develop an understanding of something. So really it models, again, something that you're very used to doing. But this might also mean that rotation takes place away from the school. And this is potentially something you might want to think about for your action research, because you will have that face-to-face time in school, but then the other time might be that they rotate between a different teacher who does something else, which might supplement the things you do, and that's up to you and your planning and how you work with the school. But then you can also have one of those rotations as being the fact that they might do some learning at home. It could just be an activity they do at home. Now, bearing in mind that we're hoping they will be in school 5 days a week, what if they weren't in school 5 days a week? So that's where this rotation model comes in. And we saw this pre-summer holidays, where students across Wales were in school for 1 day a week. They had 4 days at home. That's very much the rotation model, where they would move around that kind of model of, this is when I learn with the teacher, this is when I learn away from the teacher. The flex model, so this is really supported to have students be very self-guided. Teachers are in the room, but not always are they delivering. It can be, again, I suppose the best example is, again, that model of what we do in early years, where you set those tasks, but the teacher at no point is giving direct instruction at any one point, but they actually have a model where they can move around and support those students. So students are very self-guided. They understand the things that they want to learn about. You've set up the classroom to give them access to these things, and they can move around those things in a way that works for them. Now, again, from a technology-driven point of view, you can set up stations which allow those students to access different things, different learning activities at a time that works well for them. It's also going to offer opportunities for those students to work at home. The benefits here are that you can have that time, that face-to-face time with students in different areas. So you can support them with the technology in a face-to-face environment, but you might also, you know, put the technology to the side and work in a very different way with them. So a lot of choice in this one, probably more for older students, again, because you really are expecting them to take huge ownership of their learning. The online driver model then, this is kind of the complete opposite of what we talked about with face-to-face, and this is where everything is really online. So the blended learning that they do is very much all online. Again, they would have some face-to-face check-in opportunities, pretty similar to what I'm doing with this 4 weeks of CS3a. You're doing all of this asynchronously. And you can access things in your own time, very much independent when it suits you. But then you would have the opportunity to, you do have the opportunity to email me if you need to check over things. I do check on the Padlet wall and the Edpuzzle space. I check in there to see if there's anything that stands out that I think needs to be addressed. So there's those opportunities, but really this is about the online world driving things. Very much total lockdown situation is what we saw. But again, for older children, you wouldn't do this in a primary school unless you had to do this in a primary school. There are people that have learned online for years. This is open university. This is exactly that model that has worked and works very well for some people who need that flexibility and independence for their daily schedules, for those things that they do. And the final one to just briefly look at then is the online lab model. And that is where you potentially have space for people to be able to move around the school site, work in spaces that are dedicated to online work. Could be that it's like computer labs or computer classrooms, or just a space where you can go and sit with your technology to access things. We don't necessarily need to have the teachers available for these things because the teachers have created the resources to go online. Again, very much for older children where secondary schools have had cases where teachers haven't been able to teach their lessons, so they've created online access points and the students can do those things. So very much rather than it being pre-recorded, it's access to teachers in an online environment that you can kind of work around in those things. Again, different things for different kind of levels of where those children are, but hopefully you'll see that there are multiple models that you can choose from in terms of your looking forward, and it's useful to kind of know about each one of those as you consider the things that you might want to consider for your opportunities. So again, let's pause for a moment here, jump into the Padlet wall, and let's just reflect on some of those models and how they might support you. One, going forward with your research and your thinking of what could work in your school environment, but also just reflect on how would you like to learn out of each one of those. It'll be quite interesting to see, where you sit on that. And in fact, I think what I'll do is within the Edpuzzle section where you're answering this, I might put a survey in there to just choose one of those which you feel might work best for you. And then at the end of the week, I'll show you all this. So keep it anonymous, doesn't matter, who said what. The idea is let's have a look at, across those 6, which one you feel would benefit you most. Okay, great. So multiple tools to support with this as well. And what we've seen hugely, certainly in Wales, is the range of tools that you have access to support your learning and to support the delivery of content and feedback. So we're going to take a brief look at each one of these. I'll show you a brief example, and then we'll talk about tablets and laptops as access points. And again, useful for you to have a look at some of these videos. I've created videos on how to do some of these things. You can find lots of videos on YouTube that show you how to do these things, but you will need to find out from the school what model they currently use, if they use one at all. So Teams has probably been one of the big hits, I suppose, for lots of people over COVID. We've started using it as a pilot with our first years on the new course that we've started this year. And it's one that probably you'll see quite a lot when you go into schools. So we thought it'd be useful to show you that now, show you some of the functionality of how that works. And again, I've got videos that you can have a look at for this. If I just choose a course, which is just a training one that I've been using. This is fundamentally how Teams looks. You have the option to have these posts that you can set in. You'll see here you can add in assignments within this. Think of it similar to how we're using Shobi at the moment. It doesn't necessarily have to be an assignment in the sense of it's, you know, marked and assessed and leveled and all of those things. It's just that's a task that needs to be done. You can reply directly to things. So if, you know, this is a pinned thing, and so the replies stick with this as opposed to it being this kind of long general conversation that goes on and on and on. You lose track of it. You know, the replies that you give are stuck to this. Files, which is the background bit. So this is where your information sits, like a storage box. Ideally, you just put things in here. The access is through the post because you pinpoint it to this. So if I add something as a post, it just backs it up in files. So you don't put it in files and just say go to files and find this. You actually put what you want them to do in here. So it just streamlines it for the learners in much the way as you know, using something in Seesaw, using something in Shobi, those things. It just keeps it as a flow for the learners to know what they need to do. It's time stamped, so you just go one after the other. When you go to more, you'll see that there are additional options in here. This is where you can set assignments. You can see the grades that you've set for people. Students have their own notes, and there's a notebook which kind of adds to that as well. So again, probably more for your older children. It's not that user-friendly. It's very much used in secondary schools a lot, but primary schools have started to adopt it, thinking that, you know, we have access to Teams, so we should use it. It's not as user-friendly the younger you get, and in fact, if you're in early years, I would avoid it completely, just because it's just not simple and straightforward. And with younger learners, you need something which is a lot easier and a lot more playful. This is very office-based, right? So, you know, having posts in this way, it's not very pictorial, it's very text-based, so it's not that engaging for your younger learners. The process within it, though, is pretty simple. So, you know, I've set up a digital foundations module here. I have a general feed, which is where general conversation goes, but you can then add in additional channels. So you choose the channel that you want. So it could be a channel on a very specific thing. So I could say that we're going to have a channel on, oops, if I could spell, blended learning. And then you choose, like, do I want a description in there? Do I want it to be private or open to everyone? I'll just leave it open for now. And then it creates this new space for you. So as this just kind of goes through the process, if I jump back to that lesson, which is here, I now have this blended learning space where, again, you then have opportunities to add specific posts, and then files is a whole new file section. So this might be something you want to utilize with your students in school, again, depending on what the school is using. You can set up teams for yourself, by the way. You can set up your own team and have a play around with it, and I would urge you to do that. If you find out that's what the school is using, I would urge you to set up your own team and have a look around it. You're going to need to use your own personal account for this. It's going to clash a little bit with your university account, but you can just make a Teams account for yourself using Microsoft and just play around with making something and setting something up. The only difference you'll have is you won't have access to the education version, so you won't have access to those additional tabs over here, such as the assessment, etc., because it doesn't exist on a kind of personal use. You would have basically access to a business type use one. Other things within this, just to look at, there's a chat window, so you can have those conversations with the groups of students, and it will keep you updated on those things. You can check your assignments, and then obviously you have your overall calendar, which is where you can, you know, start Teams calls, meetings, etc., if you needed to do that. At this point, again, you'll need to check with the school as to whether you're going to be doing any synchronous online learning with any students. I would probably say that you won't from safeguarding point of view, but just check with the school to see if that is a possibility. It probably is going to be more asynchronous stuff where you might record some videos for the students to access in their own time. But again, you may well then post those videos in here and have the students respond to things in much the same way as we're doing with our first years on the course. So that's Teams. The second one to then take a quick look at supporting kind of that idea is Google Classroom, and Google Classroom works very much in the same way. And again, if you have seen this, then feel free to jump through the video. Google Classroom does have an app. It also works particularly well as if I just jump into Google on here quickly, works very well just within the web browser as well. So again, different ways of using it. I'm already logged in, so if I just jump to Google Classroom here, I can utilize Google Classroom exactly. I'm on my iPad at the moment. This is exactly how it looks if I was on a laptop or a Chromebook. So there's no difference in this. And it works in that same way where, you know, I have a stream, which is similar to that post section within Teams. I can set assignments. So here's my assignment section where I can set different activities. It could be questions, surveys, all sorts of things. And then there's obviously the place where I can invite people into this. Again, you can all have access to this. You just need to make an account. You can't use your university email again, just use a personal account, and you can create a Google Classroom for yourself and just have a play around. You might want to do this as a small group of students just to see how it works. But it all works in exactly the same way. So there's opportunities in here, obviously, for discussion. Again, if I respond to this post, then all of those responses are tagged into that same place. And it just allows you to just, you know, connect with the students and provide feedback, provide them with information, have them be able to contact you in a nice, simple way. So it's just, you know, Google's version of Teams, and Teams is Microsoft's version of Google. They all work in the same way. I find Google Classroom to be a little bit more user-friendly for younger learners. The setup is just a little bit more simplified. There's only a couple of buttons at the top that they need to go into. They wouldn't see people, obviously, because they're in the class, so it would just have their stream and it would have their work in one place. But, you know, again, you're going to need to find out what the school is using. If they've opted for Office 365, the chances are they're using Teams. And it kind of brings me on to this thought process of just because you're using Office 365 doesn't mean you just use their products, because it might not be the right thing for your learners. So people choose Office 365 or Google because that's what they've chosen as a whole school approach, but it might not be the right thing for your students in the class. So that's why those other two are useful to equally look at. Now, Shobi is the one that we're using as part of this course, so hopefully you've been able to see around that yourselves. I'll jump into it again, although we did look at it in the last session on how to utilize these things. So Shobi here, as I'll show you how it works with you guys, because this is your setup. I can set all of the modules down here as different assignments. So I've got an assignment here, or you can have a folder, which is actually how I've set it as. So each one of these is folders with work in. So again, it could be topic based, could be weekly based, could be anything you want. Slightly different to Classroom then in that sense, because it just allows you to see everything, but you choose when you go into each one of those things. And then within that, I just kind of add things in as different assignments. These are just different things I want you to look at. You all have access to this, so there you all are. And then I place things in the shared folder section. So these are the things that I want you to look at. I can write on here. I can post in various ways. So I can use video, I can use imagery, I can use links to things. I can just use my voice if I want. So you can see how this probably lends itself better to primary. Although in saying that, you shouldn't take these options away from children in secondary, but secondary schools tend to become a little bit more formalized and move away from these things. Whereas I use this with my sixth formers when I used to still teach in secondary school. You can add in lots and lots of different things in this as well. Again, it's a little bit more playful. It's a bit more colorful. You know, I know it's only a simple touch on here, but it is a little bit more colorful. And you can also do your marking live within this. The other thing with this is irrelevant of the device you're on. So again, I'm on an iPad. I could log into this on a PC. I could log into this even on a PlayStation if I needed to. So it's device agnostic, as they say. So it just gives you different ways to access those things. But again, we have looked at that before, so I won't go into that in huge detail. Oops. Back to the presentation. And the final one is Seesaw. And we've used Seesaw quite a lot. And again, really, really useful from a primary school perspective because of the way that you can make this very, very visual for your learners. So again, students being able to access things, being able to access work set by the teacher, it could be a video, and being able to respond to those things, and teachers being able to visually show all of the things that students have done. There's not much content in this one. This is just a demo one that I use. I don't think this one's any better. Oh, there we go, someone's drawn a cherry tree for me. But again, lots of opportunities to upload things in various different ways. Again, a little bit more visual, but also the opportunity to add in videos, to add in text if you want to add in text, etc. I just urge you to find out from the school what they're using. Even if they are using Teams, find out if it's being used well, and then suggest maybe you try for 4 weeks trying something different that might work better for those students. You don't have to, but it might be part of your study to have a look at something which might support the school. And then the final two things to talk about here is tablets and laptops. There's a push at the moment to get children access to stuff, but access usually means being able to log on to something to watch a video. And that's only part of blended learning, because the other part is what do I create as a result. Now, laptops are very traditional, and what you create on a laptop can be very much keyboard-based access to typing onto the device. Yes, you can use them to make video, but how do you get the video onto the laptop in the first place? So they are quite restrictive in that way. They're also not a mobile tool. They are a portable tool, but they're not mobile. I can't walk around and use a laptop. So again, thinking about what you want to use it for. So for outdoor learning, a laptop really isn't very useful because I have to find somewhere to sit down, and then ultimately I'm just having an outdoor classroom as opposed to doing outdoor learning. Tablets, obviously more portable, more mobile, access to them in different ways through text and voice and video and all of those different things, drawing, etc. Teachers tend to think that you need to have keyboard skills. Well, I think if you ask most students, they'll show you different ways to access content on a tablet without having to type on those things. Tablets, again, for early years, because they wouldn't be able to type anyway, so therefore the barrier is the typing, but the technology doesn't need to be the barrier because it can be a way to access those things. So again, thinking about what you want the students to be able to do with the device is important in choosing which device they use for the things they're trying to do. So if you want to have a creative curriculum and you know that a tablet allows them to be more creative and personal, then a tablet is the thing to do. If you want a curriculum where you're asking them to substitute writing in books for writing on a computer, then maybe a laptop is the right thing to choose. So again, you are not going to be influencing the school in terms of what they purchase before your placement. You may influence what they use after the placement. So there might be an opportunity to have a look at what tools you use in the school, if they have access to those things, maybe finding out what tools the students have at home so that you can then think about their access and what they can do with those things. Because what we do want to do is think about moving away from just, viewing something on a computer and then typing an answer to actually thinking about how we can learn in a very different way. So let's move on to the impact on learning then. One, this hugely empowers students. We're giving them opportunity to learn anytime, anywhere, anyhow. So we go back to that autonomy piece that we've looked at before of choice for learners, which can be hugely empowering. We want to focus our teachers on facilitation and not on content delivery. So it's not just about them telling the students things, it's about supporting how we learn. We can vary the activities because there can be that element of choice. We can provide students with an outlet where technology might be able to say, yes, if you want to make a rap about that, then fine, but you might want to write the poem instead. So there's that choice in how you create those things and how you access those things. It can save time for teachers. The short term, it might not, because you're developing new skills and you're having to create those resources. But ultimately, once you've created those resources, you can easily adapt those resources because it's a digital version. So it's not, necessarily a complicated process to just change what you do. Kind of leads me to this. You can tweak those lessons very, very simply to support the learners that need to be supported in a different way. I've made various resources for science in terms of books that where I've worked with schools, and I've made them about one topic, but I can just simply change the content in the book but keep the book the same because I know that works for learning, and then you just change it from plants to space, for example, just by changing some of the images, changing some of the tasks that you put in there. That's easily done, but the resource itself is already created to be engaging for the learners. And really, it's easily reviewable. So if you create those videos for your students and you're doing that as a face-to-face teaching, that student can watch that as many times as they want, whenever they want, wherever they want. And that is really powerful when you start to give opportunities for students to not have to worry about asking you to repeat something. And that's a fear that students have. It's a barrier to learning because they don't want to embarrass themselves by putting their hand up and saying, I don't quite understand. So you give them the tools to say, well, check for yourself. And so you're empowering them to be independent at the same time as thinking about, what is it that I need to understand here because I didn't listen the first time, or whatever it might be. So we're going to pause again there because I've spoke for quite a long time, and I want you to just think about some of the other ways that this approach might have an impact on the learning, both from a teacher point of view and from a student point of view. So let's take a look deeper about that impact on learners then. We've said this before about the time. There's more time to engage with the learning because we're not putting a classroom-based time limit on how long that learning needs to last for. Students, if they need to go for longer, have that opportunity to learn for as long as they want. We talk about this, about being in the flow of learning, because if you love doing what you're doing, you tend to not focus on how long you're doing it for. It's not just about memory recall. It's really about mastery of a subject. It's not learn these facts and tell me these facts. It's really about developing a deeper understanding. And we'll talk about this in future sessions about the cognitive science and the neuroscience behind memory recall and how we do those things. And actually, although we think if we just drum it into a child that they'll remember it, science shows that they will probably remember less than the time you've put into it. So actually, we're probably wasting a lot of our time in just drumming this into children. Some things work very well that way, probably things like times tables, those sorts of things, just drum it into them, they'll know it eventually. But other things that are deeper in terms of their learning, that take a bit of understanding, probably not just repeating it over and over again is probably not going to make me remember it very well. So we'll talk about memory retrieval in future sessions. It's not a prescribed approach, which means that we're focusing on individual learning needs, not talking about this from a differentiation point of view, not talking about learning styles. We're just talking about on any given day, you may learn things in a very different way. For instance, the notion of, the one size fits all, when the opposite to that exists in the fact that the way we learn is as unique as our fingerprints, which means there's a 1 in 500 billion chance that you are the same as somebody else on any given moment in terms of how you learn. And we kind of adapt to thinking, well, we do it in a school and the teacher talks and I learn. But when you take that away, when you take those kind of scaffolds away, children actually will not learn in that way. That's not necessarily right for everyone. And I'm sure you can all, if you were absolutely honest now, think about the way you learn best. And although the obvious thing is to say, well, I go to the classroom, the teacher teaches me, if we're absolutely honest, you probably have all learned things outside of education, and you probably didn't do it in a way that traditional education delivers it to you. And it can be scary because it's not the norm, but the not the norm is probably the way that some learners would prefer it to be. And we have to think about those. Education is for everyone. It's not for the masses, it's for everybody. So we have to think about how we encourage all of our students to achieve, because where schools set targets of 60, 70, 80% pass rates, you may as well say we're accepting 20, 30, 40% of our children to fail every year. And that's not good enough. Okay, so we have to think about these things. And yes, it might mean we have to think differently about our teaching, but then we adapt, right? Let's not always do it the way it's always been done. Let's adapt. I, for one, I was a PE teacher. I now teach you guys in university how to use technology, and I teach you in science. That's not what I was trained as a teacher, and I've changed as I've moved through education. I used to think that I stood at the front of the class and I taught everybody something. I now hugely believe in giving people opportunity. And you know what? That might change again as I adapt to the needs of the people in front of me. So, ultimately they're your customers and you need to do what's right for them, not what's right for you. It's very much about being relevant to the students, trying to make it that link to real world engagement, real world problem solving. How do I use things? Most of these children will have digital tools at home, be it games, computers, tablets, whatever. And the world of technology for long has been the thing that happens outside of school. But when we start to bring it into school, it becomes more relevant. And even to the fact that I've seen teachers just bring things into the classroom, and children have felt that it's cool. They want to learn because, oh, we do that at home. That's cool. School all of a sudden feels relevant and not this isolated place in society that kind of is old-fashioned and set in its ways. And children know that, right? They go home to do things and have fun, and they go to school to learn. Whereas actually learning should take place beyond the barriers of the school as well. So how do we kind of merge those two things together? We can make it a little bit more personalized. And again, by this, I don't mean differentiation. I mean personalized to the student. There is an issue here, obviously, about access to technology. It's something which the more I read about, schools are starting to see that, you know, maybe they've missed a trick, that technology's been around in a fairly cheap way for quite a long time, but schools have been very slow to move to that. And they've, yes, bought maybe 10 Chromebooks or a few iPads for the classroom, but they've never really engaged in the proper way. So personalized learning would imply that every student has access to some technology to allow them to learn in a different way, but we're not quite there yet. There are schools that are doing it. There's a multi-academy trust of 52 schools across England that have just bought an iPad for every single student. So it's 33,500 iPads bought for every student, because they personally believe that each student should have access to something to support them. Not because of COVID, they were planning on doing it before COVID. It just so happens that COVID struck and they were in a position where they'd already done all of their planning and prep and training of the staff, but they wanted to give students a personalized way to access their learning and not just listen to the teacher at the front, regurgitate information, write it in a book, those sorts of things. So what do we need in order to do this? New attitudes to assessment, simple as that. If we continue to think that we only assess what's written in a book, we're going to struggle with thinking differently about what students can do to show us what they've learned. The biggest barrier that I have when I go to schools to talk to them about using iPads is everyone's enthused and engaged and students have done some great things, and the question comes up, how do I print that out and put it in a book? Does it need to be printed out and put in a book? Who's that for? What, to check that Estin have, are okay with what you're doing? You need to just think about the needs of the learners, and if they can explain to you in a way that is digital because they've used a video to explain it, then assess that. Just think about how you assess those things and be confident that you're assessing the success criteria for that student and not their ability to write or not their ability to keep it in an exercise book. Because for one, if you had a student who couldn't write for whatever reason, even if they just had a broken arm, even what if they had a disability that they couldn't use their arms, you wouldn't judge them by their ability to write down in a book. So why do we do it for everybody else? So again, think about those things. How do we just make this a level playing field so that people can access learning in a way that works for them? This needs to be beyond just video. Blended learning is not just make a video, get people to watch it, but thinking about the engagement purposes, the ability to reflect. Reflection is a critical tool. Feedback is a critical tool. How do we build those things in? And those videos that are created can't just be someone else's video that you found on YouTube. It needs to be personalized to the people that the video is aimed at. So getting the teachers to think about creating videos that work for their students, and creating more than one potentially that shows an alternative way of doing things, so that if a child didn't understand the process you taught them about a mathematical process, you could show them an alternative way to do it and they have a choice. Which one works best for me? Thanks, teacher, you've given me more than one way of doing things. I've mentioned this before, focus on the criteria, not how it's done. Big believer in this. Technology allows us to do it in different ways. Let's start doing it. Writing everything in a book is a barrier for learners. Let's remove barriers, allow learners to learn in a way that works for them. You need to understand the role of technology. And again, for far too long, technology is seen as, oh, it's nice, we'll do some ICT, we'll make them do a PowerPoint presentation rather than writing in their book. Technology is deeper than that. It's a way that children can access things, to share passions about things. It should be in every lesson as a choice for students to be able to share what they've learned. Again, if a student has a bad arm one day and can't write in a book, you would offer them a different way to do it. Well, why shouldn't that be the way all the time? There are students that are hugely introvert and don't want to put their hand up in the class. So offer them a tool where they can share thoughts and questions to the teacher using technology, because introverts shouldn't be treated as negative or disengaged because they never talk in class. They're just introvert people. They don't want to talk in class. Let's not make them talk in class, because that's not right. They're introvert. Let's not change them from that. That's who they are. And just because someone always talks out loud doesn't mean that they know all the answers. Sometimes it's just because they're an extrovert and they want to share their voice all the time. And again, I've seen too many people judge students in the classroom because they're the quiet ones. Like, that's a bad thing. It's okay to be quiet. It's okay to not put your hand up. It's okay to sit at the back of the class because that's where you want to sit, because you engage, because you want to learn through listening as opposed to learning through actively engaging in conversation with the teacher all the time. So again, technology can allow students to access that. And I've seen that hugely in doing online webinars. And you see that by providing the chat window means that some people will be more than happy to unmute themselves and talk out loud because they're okay with that. But some people are shy and they want to just be able to talk in a safer environment. I don't want to share my voice, but I do have something to share. So using the chat window gives you that opportunity. Schools definitely need to invest in the physical things, but also an investment in a change of mindset about what education looks like. The 9 till 3 Monday to Friday is no more. People have seen that it doesn't need to be that way. So we do need to change that mindset about what we used to do and think about supporting all of those learners. At the same time, not throwing out everything that you've previously done. There are some fantastic ways that teachers educate students, and we still have face-to-face. I am not an advocate for getting rid of face-to-face. I think it's absolutely vital that we have face-to-face engagement, but how do we use that face-to-face time? Feedback is essential. How do we offer that feedback to our students in that face-to-face personalized approach where children know that you care about them and you want to support them? But also group work, and something which is a struggle in an online environment. I've seen some good examples. I know that some of you have thought about this, where you're watching these videos, but you're not on your own watching these videos. You've set up, your own, video calls to talk about the things that I'm talking about, so you can share discussion. And that's really, really important. And schools need that. Everyone needs the ability to share thoughts and ideas with other people and not just share it to a computer screen. So yes, definitely keep hold of what works well, but also don't hold on to something just because of tradition, because that's not progressive and that's not going to help anybody. So a couple of facts to kind of underpin some of these things, and that is, how do we do this right? How do we support our students in learning from the things that we've done in the last few months? And these are just some facts, some research that I've done to find out about approaches that have worked and approaches that kind of haven't worked and what the outcomes are. So one of the things, only 34% of pupils were motivated during lockdown. So 34%. And this kind of alludes to the fact that if teaching was done in a traditional way in the classroom, but you only went to the classroom because you knew you had to go to school, the second you take that fear away of you don't actually have to go to school anymore, and I choose to turn the computer on, or I choose to access that video, this kind of represents probably how many people are motivated to learn in the classroom as well. So is it because you've just taken a traditional and put it online and hope children will want to learn in a very boring way? Probably not. So, there's a fact there that you have to think about. Online learning means that children have choice, and with choice comes, I don't want to do it that way because it's boring. And you have to accept that you have to think of ways to engage the learners, because if you're going to get them to want to learn in their own time, it's going to be a little bit more exciting than maybe that traditional, I'm going to tell you because it's on the test. A really, really nice statistic, or not a nice statistic, but some good statistics. Girls were impacted more than boys around well-being. So when it comes to not being in the classroom, the stats were that girls were affected more about that loss of group social interaction with teachers and friends. But they outperformed the boys in many of the outcomes. So the kind of idea that boys are better at IT than girls, completely not true, according to some of the research that's been done, and girls actually outperformed the boys. But what happened with the boys is that they were less inclined to engage if the approach was the same as face-to-face, where boys were given the opportunity to do something different and creative and be a bit more expressionate, not just about you teach me and I tell you what I've learned, but to be creative with those things, then boys tended to engage a little bit more. And again, disadvantaged and rural children improved their results if they were connected. So those children are in those situations where technology would really support them, but potentially have not had access before, where they were provided access actually showed some really, really good results. One, because they had access to look at it in a time that worked for them. So from the disadvantaged children and rural children, you know, that ability, because they might have to travel further to school, or they've never had access to those things before, engaged in that learning because it was different to the norm. We're going to pause here, and I'd love some feedback. What do you feel about those statistics? Is that something that you have seen? Have you read about that in yourself? What do you feel about that? So we're just going to take a moment to just reflect on the how we do it right. This is a lovely sort of quote that's come from the Professor Keith Topping from the University of Dundee. He did some studies into what's gone on, and I've put this link in the reading that you'll see towards the end of the presentation. The past 6 months have been hugely disruptive, and people have seen that, and there's this kind of desire to go back to the way it was, and let's get COVID over. We want it to go back to normal, and actually normal is not the right thing to do. It is a mistake if we go back without considering the benefits of this approach for some of our students. And it might not be that it's 70-80% of our students who would benefit from doing it differently, but even if it's only 20% of our students, we owe it to them to actually consider doing it a different way. And we can't use the barriers of, we don't have the iPads, we don't have the Chromebooks, we don't have all of these things. You have to start thinking about how you can have those. And believe me, I've been in enough schools to see waste of money in printing documents out that get used once and then thrown in the bin, to know that there is money there if you just think differently about your approach. And it's easy enough to do if you want to do it. And again, lockdown happened in March, schools moved online because you had to do it. It's funny how those things are possible when you have to do it. When you don't have to do it, it's very easy to find excuses as to why you can't do it. And I think we just owe it to children to really consider what we can do differently going forward. So just a bit of review and reflect, something that might help you in your initial questions about this approach to learning within the school. Maybe some things that school probably has already thought about that you might want to engage in, but just some thought points really. Schools really do need to honestly review what they did during lockdown. What worked, what didn't work? Did we just react? Did we just think of emergency? Which absolutely, I'm sure lots did, and there's nothing wrong with that because you needed to do those things. But could you have done it in a better way? And so are you, because things are slightly back to normal now where all the children are face to face again, is that the best thing? Could you have done it differently? Did you have resources that would have supported those children? Did you really think about the impact of blended learning? Have you invested long term beyond just access to stuff? So again, there are schools now that are kind of rapidly buying cheap equipment so that if this happens again in November, children have access to it. But technology is a long-term investment. Blended learning is a long-term investment because it could change how children learn regardless of COVID. So looking at that investment in both technology, but also in training for staff and support for staff, and there's lots of it out there. So how do we engage in those teachers to be able to engage in what could be? And that kind of brings me on to this, like, let's get rid of some of those outdated approaches where we, you know, stand at the front and deliver certain things that could be a video that children could review in their own time, in their own space, etc. So again, just think about those things. How can we support our staff to think about different things? And that's really where you guys are coming in for this 4-week action inquiry project. Is just have a look at, you know, what worked. The first question there, like, you know, you're part of that process. Can you find out what they did and try and find out, you know, nobody's judging anyone because everyone tried to do their best. Absolutely. Fundamentally believe everyone tried to do their best. But if we take time now and stop to have a look at it, did we do the right thing? And there's nothing wrong with holding your hands up and saying, no, do you know what? We probably could have done this. We probably could have taken a bit more advice, or we probably could have spoke more with our local cluster of schools to find out what was working, what wasn't working. But at the time, people just didn't have time. But you do now to have a look back. And if it happens again, could we learn from some of the things that worked and some of the things that didn't work? Can you talk to the school about the investment and how some of the technology is being used in the classroom? Again, I know that we talk about children not having access to things at home, but I know for the months that schools were closed, technology was sat in the schools and not, you know, not being thought about as can we offer this out to some of the parents who don't have access? So we had Chromebooks and iPads sat in schools, and you had parents at home who didn't have access to those things. There could have been some sort of connect. And also, if we're thinking about an investment, does it have to be the school investing? I've worked with lots of schools where they put these plans out where parents can invest in the technology because they know that it's about learning and that learning takes place beyond the school. So therefore, it's not just the school that needs to pay for these things, but actually, in some cases, maybe the parents could contribute if that's a possibility. They're all options. We're just saying that that's what can exist. So again, the final kind of reflection piece from you is, what else do you think is important for schools to reflect on at this time in terms of going forward? Do you think it's okay to just go back to normal, or do we think that we should plan not just for another lockdown, but plan honestly about how blended learning could be an ongoing approach? And then these are the links. I'll put this whole deck in Showbiz. You'll be able to access the whole deck again as well, so you can have these links. But these are just links to some additional reading, some of that, the Dundee story about the benefits of online and blended learning. Good reading for you to do about what blended learning is. And as always, please do use the Padlet wall. If you've got any questions, you can put them in there, or just email me direct, and I'm more than happy to share some of my thoughts, and we can have a face-to-face call if you need to. So thanks again for listening, and hope to see you all soon.